The gunshot shattered the morning silence of Genoa, Nevada, and Gabriella Jensen didn't flinch even as the bullet kicked up dust 3 inches from her boot. She stood her ground in front of the general store, her dark eyes fixed on the 3 men who had just ridden into town, their faces twisted with the kind of hatred that festered in small places where fear bred ignorance. It was June of 1872, and the high desert sun beat down mercilessly on the oldest settlement in Nevada territory, turning the main street into a ribbon of dust and desperation. Gabriella had been buying supplies for her grandmother when Thomas Whitfield and his brothers decided to make sport of her heritage, loud enough for half the town to hear. "Look at that," Thomas had called out, his voice carrying across the wooden storefronts. "The savage princess thinks she can shop alongside decent folk. What's next? Letting her kind sit at our tables." The Whitfield brothers had come west only 2 years prior, fleeing some scandal in Ohio that no one talked about but everyone whispered. They owned nothing but a failing claim in the hills, and an inflated sense of superiority that came from ignorance and desperation. Gabriella's grandmother was Washoe, her people having lived in these valleys for thousands of years before men like the Whitfields stumbled off wagons looking for easy gold. Her father had been a Spanish trader, a good man who died when she was 12, leaving her to navigate 2 worlds that seemed increasingly hostile to anyone who didn't fit neatly into one category or another. "My people were building civilizations while yours were still figuring out which end of a plow to hold," Gabriella said, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. She knew she should walk away, but 23 years of swallowing insults had worn through her patience like water through limestone. Thomas dismounted, his hand resting on his pistol. "Your people? You mean those primitive heathens who never built a damn thing worth mentioning?" That's when he fired the warning shot. The crowd that had been gathering scattered like quail, except for one man. He stepped off the boardwalk with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he'd thought through every possible consequence and accepted them all. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. Gabriella had seen him around town for the past month, working on the Stewart Ranch, but had never spoken to him. "That's enough," the stranger said, positioning himself between Gabriella and the Whitfield brothers. His voice carried an accent that spoke of Texas but softened by time and travel. Thomas laughed, but it sounded forced. "This ain't your concern, ranch hand. I'm making it my concern." The stranger's hand didn't move toward his gun, but something in his posture suggested he wouldn't need much time if it came to that. "The lady was shopping peacefully. You're the ones disturbing the peace." "Lady," Thomas spat in the dust. "That half-breed ain't no lady." The stranger moved so fast that Gabriella barely saw it. One moment he was standing still, the next his fist connected with Thomas's jaw with a crack that echoed off the buildings. Thomas went down hard and his brothers reached for their weapons, but Sheriff Morrison chose that moment to arrive, his shotgun already leveled. "Everybody calm down right now," Morrison said. He was an older man, pragmatic and tired, who had been keeping the peace in Genoa since before Nevada was even a state. "Thomas, you and your brothers get out of town. I'm tired of your troublemaking." "He assaulted me," Thomas sputtered, blood streaming from his split lip. "I saw you fire a weapon at an unarmed woman. You're lucky I don't throw you in jail." Morrison's voice held no room for argument. "Now get." The Whitfields left, shooting venomous looks at both Gabriella and the stranger, but they left. The crowd slowly dispersed, though Gabriella could feel their eyes on her, judging, weighing, finding her somehow at fault for being targeted. She turned to the stranger, studying him properly for the first time. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a strong jaw and hands that bore the calluses of real work. There was something in his face that spoke of hard miles and harder lessons, but his eyes held genuine kindness. "Thank you," she said, "though you didn't need to get involved." "Reckon I did," he replied, picking up his hat from where it had fallen during the confrontation. "Name's Ryder Yates. I've been working at the Stewart place. Gabriella Jensen." She hesitated, then added, "You might have just made enemies for nothing." "People like the Whitfields, they don't forget. People like the Whitfields are cowards who only pick on those they think won't fight back." Ryder dusted off his hat against his leg. "They'll think twice now." They walked together toward the hitching post where Gabriella's wagon waited. The town felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the confrontation had shifted something fundamental in the air. "Your grandmother," Ryder said as they walked. "She would be Mary Jensen. I've heard folks talk about her with respect. They say she knows more about surviving in these valleys than anyone alive." Gabriella felt surprise soften her defensive walls. Most people didn't bother learning the names of the Washoe elders, much less speaking of them with respect. "You've heard correctly. She taught me everything about the plants, the seasons, how to read the weather and the shape of the clouds." "That's real knowledge," Ryder said, and the way he said it made clear he meant it. "The kind that keeps people alive. I grew up on a ranch in Texas and my best friend was Comanche. His grandfather taught me to track, to understand how the land speaks if you know how to listen. That education saved my life more than once." They reached her wagon, and Gabriella loaded her supplies, aware of Ryder's presence beside her, neither helping without permission nor walking away. It was a respectful distance that few men maintained. "Why did you come to Nevada?" she asked. "Looking for something different, I suppose. Texas got complicated after the war. Too many old feuds, too many people trying to refight battles that were already lost." He gazed toward the Sierra Nevada mountains rising in the west, their peaks still holding snow despite the summer heat. This seemed like a place where a man might start fresh. "Is it?" Gabriella asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "I'm still figuring that out." He met her eyes directly. "But I know I won't stand by and watch good people get tormented by small-minded fools." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude. Gabriella felt it like a physical thing, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "I should get back," she said, climbing onto the wagon seat. "My grandmother will worry." "Would you mind if I called on you sometime?" Ryder asked. "Properly, I mean, to pay my respects to your grandmother and perhaps take a walk if you're willing." Gabriella studied him, looking for the ulterior motives she'd learned to expect, but his face showed only honest hope, tinged with the vulnerability of someone risking rejection. "We live 2 miles north of town, near the creek. The house with the blue door," she said. "Come Sunday afternoon if you'd like." His smile transformed his face, revealing a warmth that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "I'll be there." She drove away, feeling his eyes on her until she turned the bend, and only then did she allow herself to smile. Something had shifted in her world, and for once, it felt like a shift toward possibility rather than away from it. The house where Gabriella lived with her grandmother sat nestled against a hillside, surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade. The blue door had been her father's addition, painted with pigment traded from a merchant passing through to California. Her grandmother said it reminded her of the sky before a storm, full of potential energy. Mary Jensen was 74 years old, her face a map of laughter and sorrow, wisdom and survival. She was weaving a basket when Gabriella arrived, her fingers moving with practiced precision through the willow shoots she'd gathered from the creek. You have a story in your eyes, Mary said without looking up from her work. Tell me. Gabriella did, leaving nothing out. Her grandmother listened in silence, her hands never stopping their intricate dance. When Gabriella finished, Mary set down her basket. This Ryder Yates, you saw his spirit. I think so, grandmother. He spoke of your knowledge with respect. He defended me not for glory, but because it was right. And he asked to call on you properly. Mary's eyes sparkled with something between amusement and approval. It has been too long since you let anyone close. You know why, Gabriella said quietly. I know you carry your father's loss like a stone in your heart. I know that Michael Thornton broke your trust 3 years ago when he courted you in secret, but married that merchant's daughter in public. Mary reached out and took her granddaughter's hand. But I also know that hiding from pain means hiding from joy. They are two sides of the same coin, child. Gabriella squeezed her grandmother's hand, feeling the strength still present in those aged fingers. What if he's like Michael? What if his respect is just for show? Then you will discover it and send him away. But what if he's not? What if he's the kind of man who sees your heritage as the treasure it is? Mary smiled. Sunday will tell you much. Watch how he acts when he thinks no one important is looking. That's when people show their true selves. Sunday came wrapped in the kind of perfect June weather that made the desert valleys feel like paradise. Gabriella had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing her dress, finally settling on a deep green cotton that her grandmother said made her eyes look like polished obsidian. Ryder arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, riding a sturdy bay horse and carrying wildflowers he'd clearly picked himself rather than bought. He'd cleaned up, his hair trimmed neatly, his shirt pressed, but he still wore the practical clothes of a working man rather than attempting to dress above his station. Mrs. Jensen, he said to Mary, removing his hat and bowing slightly. I'm honored to meet you. I've heard nothing but admiration for your wisdom. Mary studied him with the intensity of a hawk watching a rabbit, and Gabriella held her breath. Her grandmother's judgment mattered more than anything. You're from Texas, Mary said. It wasn't a question. Yes, madam. Born and raised on a ranch outside San Antonio. And you struck Thomas Whitfield yesterday. Yes, madam. I apologize if that created difficulties for your granddaughter. You apologize for defending her. Mary's tone was sharp. No, madam. I do that again without hesitation. I apologize only if my method brought her more trouble than my inaction would have. Mary's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Sit. Have tea. Tell me about this Comanche grandfather who taught you to track. They sat in the shade of the cottonwoods, and Ryder told stories that made Mary laugh, her eyes lighting with recognition as he described lessons that paralleled her own teachings. He listened more than he spoke, asking questions that showed genuine interest in Mary's knowledge of the plants and animals, the way the Washoe people had survived and thrived in these valleys for generations beyond counting. Gabriella watched him carefully, looking for any sign of performance or condescension, but found only authentic engagement. When Mary described the traditional gathering grounds that had been taken over by miners, Ryder's face showed real anger on her behalf. When she spoke of the old ceremonies, he listened with reverence rather than the smug superiority that too many settlers displayed. After an hour, Mary stood. Walk with him, she told Gabriella. Show him the creek path. I have work to do. It was a dismissal and a blessing combined, and Gabriella felt her heart race as she led Ryder away from the house toward the path that wound along the water. The creek ran year-round here, fed by snowmelt from the mountains, creating a ribbon of life through the arid landscape. Your grandmother is remarkable, Ryder said as they walked. The depth of knowledge she carries, the way she understands the interconnection of everything. That's wisdom you can't learn from books. Most people see her as a relic at best, an obstacle at worst, Gabriella said. The miners want the land. The ranchers want the water. No one wants to admit that we were here first, that this is stolen ground they're standing on. I know. Ryder's voice carried genuine sorrow. I've seen it happen in Texas, seen good people pushed off land their ancestors had lived on since before memory. It's not right. It's never been right. They walked in silence for a moment, the sound of the water and birdsong filling the space between words. Why do you care? Gabriella asked suddenly, stopping on the path to face him. You barely know me. You don't know my grandmother at all. Why risk yourself for strangers? Ryder met her eyes steadily. My best friend in Texas was named Running Deer. We grew up together, played together, got in trouble together. His family taught me things my own family couldn't. They showed me kindness when my father died, included me in their ceremonies, treated me like I belonged. He paused, and pain flickered across his face. When I was 18, Running Deer was killed by 3 men who thought Indians were fair game for target practice. They were never prosecuted. Hell, they were barely questioned. Gabriella felt her breath catch. I'm sorry. I swore I would never stand by again. Never let fear or convenience keep me silent when I saw injustice. His voice was firm, but his eyes held old grief. When I saw those Whitfield cowards threatening you, I saw Running Deer. I saw every time I should have spoken up louder, acted sooner. I can't bring him back, but I can honor his memory by being the kind of man he deserved to have as a friend. The honesty in his words struck Gabriella like a physical blow. This wasn't about romance or heroism. This was about a debt of honor and a deep-seated conviction that transcended any attraction he might feel toward her. That's a heavy burden to carry, she said softly. No heavier than yours, I suspect. He started walking again, and she fell into step beside him. What do you want, Gabriella? If the world were fair and you could have anything, what would you choose? No one had ever asked her that before. The question took her breath away with its simple power. I want my grandmother's knowledge to be respected rather than dismissed. I want to walk through town without bracing for insults. I want children someday who can be proud of all their heritage, not just the parts that make them acceptable. She surprised herself with the vehemence in her voice. I want to stop feeling like I have to apologize for existing. You should never apologize for existing, Ryder said. You're exactly who you're supposed to be. They reached a bend in the creek where a flat rock jutted out over the water, creating a perfect place to sit. Gabriella had come here since childhood, finding peace in the constant movement of the current. They sat together, not quite touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth. Ryder picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his hands, studying the water-worn surface. My mother was Mexican, he said suddenly. She died when I was 10, but I remember the way some people treated her in town, like she was somehow less than them, even though she could read and write in 3 languages and they could barely manage one. He set the stone down carefully. My father loved her fiercely, defended her constantly. He taught me that heritage isn't something to mock or hide. It's a gift, a connection to something larger than ourselves. Is that why you defended me? Because I reminded you of your mother? No. He turned to look at her fully. I defended you because it was right. But I'm here now, asking to know you better because you're extraordinary in your own right. Your strength, your pride, the way you refuse to be diminished by people who should be beneath your notice. That's not about anyone else. That's all you. The sun was lowering toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Gabriella felt something loosening in her chest, a knot she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't a natural part of her. I'm afraid, she admitted. Of hoping, of trusting. The last man I cared for kept me a secret and married someone his family approved of. It took me a long time to stop feeling like it was my fault, like I should have been enough. His loss, Ryder said fiercely. His cowardice and his loss. You deserve someone who's proud to stand beside you, who sees your heritage as the treasure it is. Do I? She hated the vulnerability in her voice but couldn't call it back. Yes. The certainty in his voice was unshakable. And if you'll give me the chance, I'd like to prove it to you. They talked until the sun set and the first stars appeared, sharing stories and dreams, painful memories and fragile hopes. When Ryder finally rode away, promising to return the following Sunday, Gabriella felt different. Lighter somehow, as if she'd set down a burden she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Over the following weeks, Ryder became a regular presence in their lives. He came every Sunday without fail, bringing gifts that showed thoughtfulness rather than wealth. A book of poetry for Gabriella, tobacco for Mary's pipe, fresh fish from the creek. He asked Mary to teach him about the plants, and Gabriella watched him take careful notes as her grandmother explained which roots stopped bleeding and which leaves eased fever. He learns well, Mary said one evening after Ryder had left. And more importantly, he respects the knowledge. He doesn't try to explain it away or make it fit his existing understanding. He accepts it on its own terms. You like him, Gabriella said, unable to hide her smile. I like that he sees you clearly, Mary corrected. Many men see what they want to see in a woman. He sees who you actually are. Word of Ryder's courtship spread through Genoa like wildfire, and reactions were mixed. Some of the townspeople, particularly the older families who remembered when the Washoe were neighbors rather than obstacles, approved quietly. Others, like the Whitfields, saw it as confirmation of their worst suspicions about outsiders and half-breeds corrupting decent society. Gabriella tried not to care about the whispers, but they wore on her nonetheless. She noticed the way some women pulled their children away when she walked by, as if her heritage might be contagious. She heard the muttered comments about Ryder lowering himself, throwing away his future on a woman who would never be accepted in polite company. One Saturday in late July, Gabriella was at the general store again when Martha Whitfield, Thomas's wife, approached with two of her friends. They positioned themselves deliberately to block Gabriella's path to the door. I wonder what you did to bewitch that cowboy, Martha said, her voice carrying that particularly female brand of venom that could draw blood without ever raising volume. Must be some kind of savage magic, because no white man in his right mind would choose you willingly. The words hit their mark, finding the soft, vulnerable places that Gabriella tried to armor. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the store. Mrs. Whitfield, was it? Ryder had entered through the back, carrying a crate of supplies. I couldn't help but overhear your ignorant comment. Martha's face went red. This is none of your concern. It's entirely my concern when you insult the woman I'm courting. Ryder set down the crate with deliberate care. For the record, there's no magic involved. I choose Gabriella because she's intelligent, kind, strong, and more cultured than anyone in this store. Her grandmother's people have more history in their smallest finger than your entire family has in its whole genealogy. How dare you? Martha sputtered. How dare I? How dare you stand there and mock someone whose ancestors built thriving communities while yours were dying of plague in European slums? Ryder's voice stayed level, but steel ran through every word. Gabriella's heritage goes back thousands of years in this valley. Her people developed sustainable ways of living that worked with the land instead of destroying it. That's not something to mock. That's something to learn from. The store had gone completely silent. Even the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, stood frozen behind his counter, watching the confrontation unfold. The Whitfields came here 2 years ago with nothing, Ryder continued. You've contributed exactly nothing to this community except trouble and bigotry. If anyone should be ashamed of their lack of history, it's you, not her. Martha fled, her friends scurrying after her. The remaining customers slowly returned to their business, though Gabriella could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging. Outside, Gabriella turned on Ryder. You can't keep doing that. You'll make enemies of half the town. I don't care. His jaw was set in a stubborn line she was learning to recognize. I won't stand silent while people belittle you. But it's not practical. You work here. You live here. You need these people. I need my honor more than I need their approval. He took her hands, right there on the main street where anyone could see. Gabriella, I'm not playing at this. I'm courting you because I'm falling in love with you. If that makes me unpopular with small-minded fools, so be it. Her heart stopped, then started again at double speed. You're falling in love with me. Have been since the moment you refused to back down from 3 armed men. His smile was crooked, vulnerable. Probably even before that, if I'm honest. The first time I saw you in town, you were helping an older man carry his supplies to his wagon. You didn't make a show of it. You just saw someone who needed help and provided it. That's who you are. Gabriella felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from a heart too full to contain itself. I'm falling in love with you too, but I'm terrified. Of what? Of this being temporary. Of you waking up one day and realizing the cost of loving me is too high. Ryder pulled her closer, and she could feel his heart beating against her palms where their hands were joined. The cost of not loving you would be higher. I'd rather face 1,000 Martha Whitfields than spend my life wondering what we might have been. They stood there on the street, holding hands in full view of anyone who cared to look, and Gabriella felt something shift inside her. This was a declaration, a choice to be visible rather than hidden, to claim her place rather than apologize for it. August arrived with its brutal heat, and with it came news that sent ripples through Genoa. The Whitfield brothers had been arrested in Carson City for trying to rob a stagecoach. They'd been caught red-handed, and Thomas had made things worse by shooting at a deputy. All 3 were going to prison, and Martha Whitfield was returning to Ohio in disgrace. Looks like trouble tends to find its own level, Sheriff Morrison said when he shared the news with Ryder and Gabriella. Those boys were always heading for bad ends. You just accelerated the timeline. With the Whitfields gone, something eased in the town. It wasn't that everyone suddenly accepted Gabriella or approved of her relationship with Ryder, but the most vocal opposition had been removed, and others lacked the energy to take up the cause. Ryder had been saving his money carefully, and in September he approached Mary Jensen with a formal request. Gabriella watched from inside the house as he spoke to her grandmother outside, his hat in his hands, his posture respectful but not servile. Mary's face revealed nothing, but after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded. Ryder's smile could have lit the whole valley. He asked permission to marry you, Mary said when she came inside. With proper respect, acknowledging both your heritages, promising to honor all of who you are. What did you say? Gabriella whispered, though she already knew. I said yes, provided you agree. He's a good man, granddaughter, not perfect, but good where it matters. He sees you clearly and loves what he sees. That evening, Ryder proposed by the creek, on the flat rock where they'd first really talked. He'd made the ring himself, working with a jeweler in Carson City to create something unique. It was silver, set with a turquoise stone that matched the Nevada sky, engraved with a pattern that honored Washoe basketry designs. I wanted it to represent all of you, he said as he slipped it onto her finger. Every part of your heritage, because every part is precious. Gabriella said yes through happy tears, and they sat together watching the stars emerge, planning a future that had seemed impossible just months before. They married in October when the heat finally broke, and the aspens turned gold in the mountains. It was a small ceremony that honored both traditions. Mary performed the Washoe blessings while Reverend Patterson, one of the few clergymen sympathetic to mixed marriages, handled the legal requirements. The Stewart family attended, as did several other ranchers and townspeople who had come to respect Ryder's integrity and Gabriella's strength. There were absences, too, people who couldn't bring themselves to celebrate a marriage that crossed lines they considered sacred. But Gabriella found she didn't care as much as she'd expected. Looking at Ryder beside her, at her grandmother's proud face, at the friends who had come to share their joy, she felt rich beyond measure. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, close enough to care for Mary but far enough to build their own life. Ryder continued working at the Stewart Ranch, but he also began learning leatherwork from an older craftsman, developing a skill that would eventually provide additional income. Gabriella started teaching some of the town's children, sharing her knowledge of reading and mathematics, and gradually, some parents began asking if she might also teach about the plants and herbs her grandmother knew so well. Winter came gently that year, with snow that blanketed the valley in pristine white. Gabriella and Ryder spent long evenings by their fire, reading to each other, making plans, learning the rhythms of married life. They argued sometimes, usually about his tendency to leap into conflicts on her behalf when she would have preferred to handle things herself, but they learned to navigate disagreements with honesty and respect. "I know you can fight your own battles," Ryder said after one such argument. "But can you understand that I need to stand beside you? Not in front of you, but beside you. We're partners in this." "Beside, not in front," Gabriella repeated. "I can agree to that." In February, Gabriella discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She thought of her mother who had died in childbirth, and fear clawed at her throat. Mary, now frailer but still sharp as ever, held her granddaughter close. "You are strong like all the women in our line. Your mother's death was not weakness. It was bad fortune. You will survive, and your child will thrive." Ryder was ecstatic but terrified in his own way. He threw himself into preparing their home, building a cradle with wood he carefully selected and sanded until it was smooth as silk. He read every book on childbirth he could find, often staying up late memorizing what to do in case the doctor couldn't arrive in time. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Gabriella said one evening, watching him work on the cradle by lamplight. "I hope so. I want to be the kind of father who teaches our children to be proud of all their heritage, to stand up for what's right even when it's hard." He looked up at her, his eyes serious. "I want them to have the courage you showed that day in town, facing down those cowards without flinching." Spring came with an explosion of wildflowers, and with it came their son. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Gabriella feared she would follow her mother's path. But Mary was there, using all her knowledge of herbs and positioning and doctor. Matthews worked tirelessly through the night. When Gabriella finally held her baby boy in her arms, looking at his perfect tiny face that combined her features and Ryder's in ways that seemed miraculous, every moment of pain vanished. "He's beautiful," Ryder whispered, tears streaming down his face as he touched his son's tiny hand. "He's absolutely perfect." They named him Robert after Ryder's father, with a middle name in Washoe that Mary chose. It meant strong spirit, and looking at her son's alert eyes already tracking movement and sound, Gabriella thought it fit perfectly. The town's reaction to Robert was complicated. Some people saw him as proof of their worst fears about mixing races, a child who belonged nowhere. But others, increasingly, saw him simply as a baby, innocent and sweet, and gradually softened their stance toward Gabriella and Ryder. Gabriella didn't care much either way anymore. She had her family, her grandmother, her husband, and now her son. She had work that mattered, teaching children who soaked up knowledge like the desert soaked up rain. She had love that didn't demand she diminish herself to be acceptable. Mary held her great-grandson often, singing old songs in Washoe that Gabriella remembered from her own childhood. She taught Gabriella the traditional ways to carry a baby, the plants that would help with teething, the stories that had been passed down for generations. "He will know where he comes from," Mary said, "and he will be proud." When Robert was 6 months old, Mary fell ill. It came on suddenly, a fever that wouldn't break despite all her knowledge of healing plants. Dr. Matthews did what he could, but at 77, Mary's body had simply reached the end of its journey. She died on a clear autumn morning with Gabriella holding one hand and Ryder holding the other, and Robert sleeping peacefully in a basket beside the bed. Her last words were in Washoe, a blessing that Gabriella would treasure forever. The grief was enormous, but Gabriella found comfort in knowing her grandmother had lived to see her settled and happy, had held her great-grandson and passed on her knowledge. Mary had survived when so many of her people had not. She had kept traditions alive through sheer force of will. That legacy would continue through Gabriella and Robert, and whatever other children might come. They buried Mary on the hillside above the house, overlooking the valley that had been her home for 77 years. People came from all over to pay respects, including some who had never shown Mary proper honor in life, but at least had the decency to acknowledge her passing. Ryder stood beside Gabriella throughout, holding her when she wept, taking Robert when she needed both hands free to receive condolences. His presence was a constant comfort, never overwhelming but always available. In the months after Mary's death, Gabriella threw herself into preserving her grandmother's knowledge. She wrote down every plant name, every use, every story she could remember. Ryder helped, his careful handwriting filling notebook after notebook with information that might otherwise be lost. "This matters," he said when Gabriella questioned whether anyone would care about her documentation. "It matters now, and it will matter even more in the future. You're preserving something irreplaceable." As Robert grew, becoming a toddler with his father's smile and his mother's determined spirit, Gabriella and Ryder built a life that honored all their traditions. They celebrated Christmas and the winter solstice. They taught Robert English and Washoe and some Spanish. They showed him how to ride and how to identify plants and how to read before he was 4. The town slowly changed around them. Some people would never accept their family, but increasingly they were seen as simply part of Genoa's landscape. Ryder's reputation as a skilled craftsman and honest man opened doors. Gabriella's knowledge of healing plants made her invaluable during illness outbreaks. Robert's cheerful nature charmed even some of the initially skeptical. When Robert was 3, Gabriella became pregnant again. This time the fear was less sharp, blunted by the knowledge that she had survived once and could do so again. Their daughter was born on a summer evening, arriving so quickly that Dr. Matthews barely made it in time. She had Gabriella's dark eyes and a head of hair that promised to be as thick and unruly as her father's. They named her Grace and gave her a Washoe middle name that meant gentle rain, because she came into the world with less drama than her brother but was no less precious. Robert was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Ryder built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, using techniques he'd learned from Mary for passive cooling and careful window placement to capture breezes. "I want it to reflect all of us," he said as he worked. "Your heritage, mine, the children's, a house that tells the truth about who we are." The house took shape slowly, and when it was finished, it was beautiful. Open and light, with spaces for Gabriella's herb drying and Ryder's leatherwork, a large kitchen for teaching the children to cook, bedrooms that caught the morning sun. On the mantel, Ryder placed something he'd commissioned from an artist in San Francisco. It was a painting of Mary, rendered from a photograph Gabriella hadn't even known existed. Mary looked powerful and wise, her eyes holding all the knowledge of her people, her posture proud despite the weight of years. "So the children will always know their great-grandmother," Ryder said. "So they'll understand the strength they come from." Gabriella stood before the painting, tears streaming down her face, and felt Ryder's arms come around her from behind. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing her, for seeing all of us. How could I not? You're my whole world." Years passed in the way they do when life is full and good. Robert grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Grace became a whirlwind of energy and questions, fascinated by everything, fearless in ways that gave her mother heart palpitations. Ryder's leatherwork became renowned throughout Nevada, his pieces sought after for their quality and beauty. He employed several apprentices, teaching them not just the craft, but the philosophy Mary had taught him about working with materials respectfully. Gabriella's teaching expanded into a small school that met in their home 3 days a week. She taught reading, writing, mathematics, and natural history to anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of their ability to pay. Some parents compensated her with goods or labor. Others paid nothing, and that was fine too. Knowledge, she believed, was meant to be shared. When Robert was 12 and Grace was 9, Gabriella became pregnant unexpectedly with their third child. At 39, she had thought her childbearing years were behind her, but life had other plans. This pregnancy was harder than the others, leaving her exhausted and uncomfortable. Ryder worried constantly, hovering in ways that would have been annoying if they weren't so obviously rooted in love. Their second son arrived in early spring, a tiny baby who needed extra care in his first weeks but who grew stronger each day. They named him Matthew, with a Washoe middle name meaning unexpected gift. "Our family is complete," Ryder said, holding his youngest son while their older children crowded around to see their baby brother. "This is everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dreamed I'd have." Gabriella looked at her family, at the home they'd built, at the community they'd created through sheer persistence and love, and felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. She thought about the girl she'd been, standing in the street facing down the Whitfield brothers, angry and alone. She thought about the fear she'd carried, the conviction that her heritage was something to overcome rather than celebrate. And she thought about Ryder, stepping off that boardwalk to stand beside her, seeing her heritage not as a burden but as a gift, treating her grandmother's knowledge with reverence, insisting that their children learn and honor all parts of themselves. "I love you," she said, the words inadequate for the depth of feeling behind them. "Thank you for seeing me, for seeing all of us." "Always," Ryder promised. "From that first day until my last breath, I will always see you clearly and love what I see." They stood together in their home, surrounded by their children, and Gabriella knew that this was the happiness her grandmother had wanted for her. Not the absence of struggle, because struggle was part of life, but the presence of love that honored rather than diminished, that celebrated rather than mocked, that saw heritage as the precious gift it truly was. Robert grew into a fine young man who attended university in San Francisco, studying law with the intention of fighting for justice for people like his family. Grace became a teacher herself, inheriting her mother's passion for education and her great-grandmother's knowledge of traditional medicine. Matthew, the unexpected gift, showed early talent for art, filling sketchbooks with detailed drawings of plants and animals and people. Ryder and Gabriella grew old together, their hair silvering, their bodies moving more slowly but their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents multiple times over, as their children married and had children of their own, each generation mixing heritages and creating something new while honoring what came before. On their 30th wedding anniversary, sitting on the porch of the home Ryder had built, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed countless generations of Gabriella's ancestors, Ryder took her hand. "I would do it all again," he said. "Every argument we had, every struggle we faced, every moment of fear or doubt, I'd do it all again for this." "So would I," Gabriella agreed. "You honored my heritage when others mocked it. You saw it as the treasure it is. You gave our children pride in all parts of themselves." "We gave that to them together," Ryder corrected. "Your strength, your refusal to be diminished, your determination to preserve your grandmother's knowledge. That's what gave them pride. I just stood beside you while you changed the world." Gabriella laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. "I didn't change the world. I just lived in it honestly." "Sometimes that's the same thing." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. In the house behind them, they could hear their youngest grandson practicing piano, the notes drifting through the open windows. Down in the valley, lights began to glow in Genoa's windows, the town that had been hostile and then grudgingly accepting and finally, mostly, welcoming. Gabriella thought about the journey that had brought her here, from that moment of confrontation in the street to this moment of peace and completion. She thought about all the people who had touched their lives, some with kindness and some with cruelty, but all of them part of the story. And she thought about Ryder, the cowboy who had stepped forward when others stepped back, who had seen her heritage not as something to mock or tolerate, but as something to honor and celebrate. He had given her the gift of being fully herself, of never having to choose between parts of her identity or hide pieces of her soul. That gift had allowed her to give the same to their children and grandchildren, creating ripples that would spread through generations yet unborn. "Thank you," she whispered one more time, leaning her head against his shoulder. "For what?" Ryder asked, though he knew, for everything. "For seeing me, for loving me, for honoring my heritage when the world wanted to diminish it." "It was the easiest thing I ever did," Ryder said softly. "Loving you has been the simplest, most natural thing in my life. Everything else was just details." They sat together as night fully claimed the sky, two people who had built a life on respect and love, who had refused to let prejudice define their story, who had honored all their heritages and created something beautiful in the process. And when they finally went inside, hand in hand, they did so knowing that their love had been worth every challenge, every struggle, every moment of doubt. They had built not just a family but a legacy, one that honored the past while creating space for the future. It was, Gabriella thought as she fell asleep in Ryder's arms, exactly what her grandmother would have wanted. A life lived fully, honestly, with pride in all parts of herself and love that honored rather than demanded change. And it was more than enough. It was everything.